This is Strides to Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Esther Adams. Picture a scene most of us have lived through in some form. Someone close to you is struggling, maybe grieving, maybe overwhelmed, and you are standing right there in front of them. And instead of feeling drawn toward them, ready to help, you feel something closer to the opposite, a kind of internal recoil, discomfort, an urge to look away, to change the subject, to leave the room under some polite excuse. If you have ever felt that and quietly judged yourself for it, wondered what kind of person feels averse to someone else's pain instead of moved by it, I want to spend this episode complicating that judgment because the research suggests something genuinely useful here. That recoil is not a failure of character. It may be your nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems do by default, and understanding why can change what you do the next time it happens. Here's the puzzle at the center of today's episode. We tend to talk about compassion as though it were simply empathy taken one step further, as though feeling someone else's pain naturally overflows into wanting to help them. But when researchers actually study what happens in the brain and body when a person witnesses suffering, they find something more complicated. The default response to suffering is not reliably compassion, it is often distress. And distress left unaddressed does not reliably convert into helping behavior. Sometimes it produces the opposite: withdrawal, self protection, a kind of shutting down. So, the real question this research is trying to answer is not what compassion feels like. It is what has to happen, cognitively and neurologically, for concern about another person's suffering to actually become effective, motivated care, rather than dissolving into personal distress or avoidance. Let's start by getting a definition on the table, because this turns out to matter more than it might seem. Researchers studying this area have made a specific and, I think, genuinely important distinction. Compassion is not classified as an emotion in the same category as fear or sadness. It is defined as a motivation, specifically a motivation to help. That distinction shows up at the level of brain networks. Compassion relies on networks associated with positive feelings and reward, the same broad systems involved in things like warmth, nurture, and social bonding. Empathy, by contrast, particularly when it tips into what researchers call empathic distress, activates pain processing networks. This is not a minor technical distinction. It means that feeling someone else's pain and wanting to help them are, at the level of the brain, meaningfully different processes running through different circuitry, and one does not automatically produce the other. This is where the concept of empathic distress becomes central to understanding why compassion sometimes fails to appear when we would expect it. Emotional empathy is fast, it is automatic. It happens before you have time to decide whether you want it to happen. Even infants show distress reactions simply from witnessing another person's suffering, which tells you this is not a learned social skill so much as a built in, early developing reflex. The problem is that this automatic emotional contagion is fundamentally self oriented in its raw form. When you catch someone else's pain reflexively, before any further processing occurs, what you are experiencing is, in a real sense, your own aversive state, not a clear read on theirs. Researchers have described this as a condition in which a person cannot clearly distinguish whether the fear or distress they are feeling is located in themselves or in the other person. That confusion matters because a self oriented aversive state tends to produce self protective behavior. You want the discomfort to stop, and the fastest way to make an aversive feeling stop is often to withdraw from whatever is causing it. Which means the same instinct that lets you register someone else's suffering in the first place can, without a further step, push you away from them rather than toward them. So, what is that further step? This is where cognitive empathy comes in, a slower, more effortful process that requires deliberately taking another person's perspective, actually working to understand what they are experiencing rather than simply absorbing a diffuse signal of distress. This deliberate mentalizing effort appears to be a genuinely distinct process from the automatic emotional contagion that gets triggered first, and it seems to be this second, more effortful stage that opens the door to compassion rather than distress, because it requires you to locate the suffering correctly in the other person rather than experiencing it as an undifferentiated alarm inside yourself. Neuroimaging research gives us a fairly precise picture of what this shift looks like at the level of brain activity. One study used what researchers call an implicit compassion promotion task, essentially training designed to shift a person's automatic responses to suffering without requiring effortful, conscious reflection in the moment. After this training, participants showed reduced attentional vigilance to fearful faces, meaning they were less automatically hijacked by cues of distress, and they showed a corresponding decrease in empathic distress while watching other people suffer, both physically and psychologically. Critically, these two changes, the reduced vigilance and the reduced distress together, explained an increase in participants' intentions to help. This is a meaningful finding because it maps a mechanism. Reducing the automatic, self oriented alarm response is not incidental to compassion. It appears to be a necessary step that clears space for care oriented motivation to actually take hold. At the same time, researchers observed increased activity and increased functional connectivity in a region called the medial orbitofrontal cortex, often abbreviated MOFC. This is a region that has been consistently linked to prosocial motivation, the kind of brain activity associated with wanting to act on behalf of someone else's well being. And the connectivity finding is worth sitting with for a moment because it tells you something about how distributed this process is. The MOFC showed increased functional coupling with the inferior parietal cortex and the inferior frontal gyrus, regions that are the human counterparts of what was first identified in macaque monkeys as a mirror neuron system involved in simulating other people's actions and, more broadly, in sharing goals and emotional states. Additional activity showed up in the left precuneus and the left angular gyrus, regions tied to perspective taking and to understanding what another person is experiencing internally. Put together, what this suggests is that compassion, at the neural level, is not a single switch flipping from bad feeling to good feeling. It looks more like a coordinated recruitment of reward circuitry, mentalizing circuitry, and simulation circuitry, all working in concert. With the strength of that coordination, specifically the connectivity between the reward related MOFC and the mentalizing and mirror related regions, predicting how much a person's helping intentions actually increased. I want to translate that into something closer to lived experience because the mechanism is worth more than the anatomy. Think about the difference between two moments. In the first, you walk into a room and someone is crying, and your body reacts before your mind catches up. Tension, a slight urge to step back, an unformed wish that this were not happening in front of you. That is the fast, automatic layer, largely self protective in its raw form. In the second moment, something shifts. You actually orient toward the person. You start to track what they specifically need right now, not suffering in the abstract, but this person's particular experience, and the tension in you starts to reorganize itself around the question of how to help rather than how to escape. That shift from an undifferentiated alarm to a specific, other directed orientation is what the brain data seems to be capturing. It is not that the first reaction is wrong or shameful. It may simply be the necessary first pass that has not yet been converted into the second. This brings us to a question that I think deserves real attention because it changes how we think about people who seem to struggle with this conversion more than others. What determines whether a given person reliably makes that shift from distress to compassion or gets stuck in the first stage? Developmental research offers part of the answer, and it points earlier in life than you might expect. Studies of young children have found that the ability to recognize another person's distress accurately as a genuinely separate experience rather than an undifferentiated alarm strengthens with age and is shaped by two specific capacities. The first is theory of mind, the cognitive ability to understand that other people have mental states, beliefs, and feelings distinct from your own. The second is attachment security, the internal working model a child develops from early relationships about whether closeness and dependence on others is generally safe. Children with more advanced theory of mind and with secure attachment representations show significantly more of what researchers call empathic concern, meaning a genuinely other directed response to a distressed peer or adult rather than becoming overwhelmed by their own reaction. The contrast group here is telling. Children with resistant or disorganized attachment patterns showed more self distress in response to witnessing someone else's suffering, and that self distress appeared to interfere with or block the progression from noticing suffering to acting compassionately on it. I think this finding deserves more weight than it usually gets in casual conversations about compassion because it suggests the capacity to convert someone else's pain into effective care is not simply a matter of willpower or moral effort in the moment. It has developmental roots that trace back to whether a person's early relationships taught them, at a largely nonverbal level, that closeness to another person's distress is survivable, or whether it taught them that proximity to distress is itself dangerous. If your early attachment experiences left you without a reliable sense that you can approach someone's pain without being destabilized by it, then the automatic alarm response to witnessing suffering may not resolve as easily into the second stage, the effortful, other oriented reorientation, because a part of the system is still treating the whole situation as a threat to be managed rather than a person to be helped. There is a detail in this research that I think deserves specific attention because it complicates a common assumption about who tends to struggle with compassion. Researchers found that distress severity itself acts as a moderator. Situations involving higher distress tended to elicit more empathic concern and more prosocial behavior overall, not less, which suggests the issue for children with insecure attachment patterns was not that they were somehow indifferent to suffering. If anything, they may have been more reactive to it. The difficulty seems to sit specifically in how that heightened reactivity got processed, whether it stayed organized around the other person's experience or collapsed into an undifferentiated alarm centered on the child's own discomfort. This is a subtle but important distinction. A child who struggles to convert witnessed suffering into compassionate action is not necessarily a child who cares less. In some cases, they may be a child whose early relationships did not give them a reliable template for staying oriented outward once their own distress system activated. Which brings us directly to something that I think is one of the more counterintuitive findings in this entire body of research. For some people, compassion itself, not suffering, but the actual experience of being shown care or of directing care toward themselves, functions as a threat signal. This sounds almost paradoxical. Why would warmth be frightening? But the research on this is fairly consistent. Some individuals show genuine resistance and fear in response to signals of social safeness and caring, experiencing compassion as something the threat system needs to respond to rather than something to simply receive. People who are high in hostile self criticism, meaning their internal relationship with themselves defaults to harsh judgment rather than reassurance, show measurable amygdala activation, the brain's threat detection hub, when they attempt self reassurance. In some studies, high self critics actually released stress hormones during compassion focused imagery, exercises specifically designed to generate feelings of warmth and safety. Their body responded to an invitation toward kindness the way it might respond to an actual threat. There is a related finding from a study involving offender populations that I think illustrates just how literal this threat response can be. When researchers attempted to stimulate what is sometimes called the soothing system, the physiological state associated with safety and calm, in a group of men with high hostility and self criticism, the result was a reduction in heart rate variability rather than the expected increase. Heart rate variability is generally a marker of flexible, adaptive nervous system functioning, and higher variability is usually the goal of a successful calming intervention. Here, the attempt to soothe produced the opposite physiological signature: more rigidity, not less, which is a fairly direct demonstration that for someone whose threat system has been conditioned to treat warmth as unsafe, you cannot simply apply a compassion exercise and expect it to land the way it would for someone without that conditioning. The threat response has to be recognized and, in some sense, worked with directly rather than assumed away. I find this genuinely important because it reframes a fairly common piece of self help advice, the instruction to just be kinder to yourself or to more consciously generate compassion for others, as though compassion were simply a matter of trying harder or deciding to feel differently. For a meaningful subset of people, the barrier is not effort. It is that the nervous system has learned, often for good reason given a person's history, to treat closeness and care as dangerous, and that learned response needs to be addressed on its own terms before compassion practices are likely to produce the calming effect they are designed for. Given all of this complexity, distress that can override care, developmental roots that shape how easily someone makes that override, and for some people, an active threat response to compassion itself, a natural question follows: can any of this actually be trained, or are we simply describing fixed traits that some people have and others do not? The evidence here is genuinely encouraging, but with an important qualification that I want to walk through carefully, because the qualification is where the real insight lives. Researchers ran a large scale study, more than 300 participants, testing three different types of mental training across three consecutive training modules, each lasting around 3 months. One module focused purely on attention, essentially training the capacity to stabilize and direct focus, similar to foundational mindfulness practice. A second module focused on socio-affective skills, things like loving kindness practice, and deliberately generating feelings of warmth and pro-social motivation. A third focused on socio-cognitive skills, essentially perspective taking and theory of mind. What they found was that each module produced gains specifically in its own domain, and this is the important part, largely did not produce gains in the other domains. Attention training improved attentional performance. It did not increase compassion. Socio-affective training increased compassion measurably. And this was the module that produced the largest compassion gains of the three. Socio-cognitive training partially improved theory of mind. In a related study, researchers looked specifically at emotional reactivity while viewing images of human suffering and found that only the socio-affective module produced a significant reduction in negative affect during that task. The attention module and the metacognitive module did not. This is a finding worth pausing on because it directly contradicts an assumption a lot of people carry into their own wellness routines, which is that general mindfulness practice, learning to sit still, to observe your breath, to notice your thoughts without reacting to them, will naturally cultivate compassion as a downstream benefit. The research suggests that is not automatically true. Attention training builds attention. It does not, by itself, build compassion. Compassion appears to require its own specific, targeted practice, one that explicitly and deliberately works with feelings of warmth, care, and other directed motivation, rather than simply hoping that generalized calm will eventually generate care as a side effect. There was, however, a meaningful piece of nuance in how these modules interacted with each other. Participants who completed the attention focused presence module before moving into the socio-affective affect module showed a larger overall improvement in compassion than participants who practiced the socio-affective module without that earlier foundation. In other words, attention training on its own did not produce compassion, but it appeared to prepare the ground for the compassion training that followed, presumably by giving people a more stable, less reactive baseline from which to engage in the more emotionally demanding work of deliberately generating care. This has a fairly intuitive translation. If you are constantly distracted, or if your attention is easily hijacked by whatever is emotionally loudest in a given moment, you may not have the stability required to sit with someone else's suffering long enough to move past the automatic distress response and into the slower, more effortful, compassionate response. Building that stability first, even though it does not create compassion by itself, seems to make the subsequent compassion training land more effectively. There is also an important distinction in how self compassion specifically gets trained, because the mechanism appears to differ depending on the type of practice. In mindfulness based training, increases in self compassion were driven primarily by a decrease in empathic distress, essentially the same distress reduction mechanism we discussed earlier, just applied inward rather than toward another person. But in a different kind of training, structured socio emotional practice done in pairs, increases in self compassion were driven by something else entirely, an increase in acceptance. This tells us something worth remembering. Even within the category of self compassion, there may be more than one legitimate pathway to the same outcome, and different practices seem to recruit genuinely different psychological mechanisms to get there, rather than all roads simply converging on one universal process. This distinction between acceptance and reappraisal as regulatory pathways shows up again in research connecting self compassion to broader emotion regulation. Higher momentary self compassion predicted greater use of both acceptance and reappraisal in daily life, and these regulation strategies partly explain the link between self compassion and overall well being. Interestingly, the positive and negative components of self compassion, meaning active self kindness versus the absence of harsh self judgment, connected to different regulation strategies. The positive component was specifically tied to more acceptance and reappraisal. The negative component, essentially ongoing self criticism, was tied instead to rumination and distraction, strategies generally understood to be less adaptive over time. This suggests self compassion is not simply the opposite pole of self criticism on a single dimension. It behaves more like two at least partially separate systems, each pulling a person toward a different, fairly distinct set of regulatory habits. Before we get to a real clinical example, I want to widen the lens a little because so far we have been talking about compassion largely as a single process, distress resolving into care. But researchers who have tried to build reliable ways of measuring compassion have found it useful to break it apart into more than one component. And I think that breakdown is genuinely clarifying. Compassion has been operationalized across four domains: affective, cognitive, behavioral, and interpersonal, each treated as its own set of skills that can be cultivated somewhat independently, and importantly, independently from general mindfulness. The affective domain covers the felt experience of warmth, care, and concern, roughly what we have been describing so far. The cognitive domain covers perspective taking, the ability to accurately model what another person is going through, which lines up with the theory of mind research we discussed earlier. The behavioral and interpersonal domains are a little less intuitive, and they matter more than you might expect. They cover the concrete, observable skills involved in actually expressing care in a way another person can receive, things like specific verbal cues, nonverbal cues, active listening, and the ability to ask personalized questions and adjust your response based on what someone actually says back to you, rather than delivering a generic, one size fits all gesture of concern. I think this matters because it explains something that otherwise seems puzzling, which is why a person can feel a great deal of internal warmth towards someone who is suffering and still fail to make that person feel cared for. Feeling compassion and communicating compassion effectively appear to draw on at least partially separate skill sets. The internal affective shift from distress to care is necessary, but it is not sufficient on its own to produce an interaction that the other person experiences as genuinely supportive. In healthcare settings specifically, researchers have found that compassionate communication depends on a fairly specific, learnable repertoire, tailoring questions to the individual patient, picking up on nonverbal signals, adjusting engagement based on how someone responds. These are not vague personality traits. They function more like a communication skill set, the kind of thing that can be taught, practiced, and refined independent of how naturally warm a given practitioner already feels on the inside. There's also an interesting design question buried in how compassion training programs are typically structured, which is whether the practice should be oriented toward compassion for others, compassion for yourself, or some blend of the two. When researchers reviewed a large number of compassion training studies, they found that the large majority incorporated elements of both self compassion and other compassion together, rather than treating them as entirely separate tracks. Among the studies that did emphasize one over the other, a meaningful minority focused primarily on self compassion, while roughly half focused primarily on compassion directed outward toward other people. This blended approach seems to reflect something in the underlying contemplative traditions many of these training programs draw from, traditions that tend to treat compassion for the self and compassion for others as two expressions of the same underlying capacity rather than as fundamentally separate skills, partly because rigidly separating self from other is, in many of those frameworks, part of what keeps a person stuck in self protective distress in the first place. I find that framing useful because it offers a partial answer to something we touched on earlier, the person who feels a kind of threat response to warmth directed at themselves. If self compassion and other compassion are trained through overlapping rather than entirely separate mechanisms, it suggests that someone who struggles to receive kindness directed inward might still make progress by starting with compassion practice aimed outward toward someone else before working directly on the harder, more threat laden target of their own self criticism. The skill being built is related enough that progress in one direction appears to carry some benefit toward the other, even though, as we discussed, the specific threat response tied to self directed warmth may still need its own targeted attention eventually. Let's talk about what happens when this kind of training gets applied in a real clinical context, because it grounds all of this in something with tangible consequences. In a study of people with chronic low back pain, brief self compassion training produced measurable changes in how the brain processed evoked pain. Specifically, the training reduced activity in the temporoparietal junction, a region involved in what researchers call salience processing, essentially how much alarm-worthy weight the brain assigns to a given sensation. That reduction in salience-related activity correlated strongly with reduced clinical pain intensity, as reported by participants. At the same time, the training increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, a region tied to effortful emotion regulation during the anticipation of pain, suggesting participants were engaging more active regulatory control over an experience that used to simply overwhelm them. This is a genuinely striking result because it shows self compassion training doing something beyond making people feel generally nicer toward themselves. It appears to be reshaping how the nervous system evaluates and responds to a specific physical ongoing source of suffering. There is one more piece of the self compassion research I want to bring in before we move to caregiving settings, because it speaks to why this capacity matters beyond any single difficult moment. Self compassion has been linked to something researchers call psychological flexibility, essentially, the ability to stay open to whatever is happening in the present moment, including difficult emotions, while still acting in ways that align with what actually matters to you, rather than being pulled entirely off course by discomfort. People higher in self compassion tend to show a more problem solving orientation when things go wrong, alongside a more balanced form of optimism, neither denying difficulty nor catastrophizing it. People lower in self compassion, by contrast, tend to default to self criticism and what researchers describe as depressive inaction, a kind of paralysis where the harshness of the internal response to a setback becomes a bigger obstacle than the setback itself. This gives us a slightly different angle on why the training modules we just discussed matter so much. It is not only that self compassion feels better in the moment, it appears to change the range of responses genuinely available to a person when something goes wrong, opening up problem solving and flexible engagement in place of the narrower, more rigid loop of self criticism and shutdown. Healthcare and caregiving settings provide another window into why all of this matters beyond the individual level. Prolonged, unrecognized empathic distress, the kind that never successfully converts into the more regulated, compassionate response, shows up in psychotherapists and other caregivers as anxiety, irritability, fatigue, and even physical pain, a pattern closely related to what gets called burnout. Brief interventions, combining mindfulness and self compassion training, in some cases as short as 4 weeks, have been shown to reduce emotional exhaustion and increase a caregiver's sense of personal accomplishment. This matters because it reframes burnout, at least partially, not simply as the result of working too hard, but as a downstream consequence of chronically getting stuck in the empathic distress stage without the tools or the conditions to complete the shift into sustainable other directed compassion. I do want to be honest about where the evidence base has real limits, because the popular conversation about compassion training sometimes moves faster than the science actually supports. Much of the workplace focused research on compassion interventions has not measured what researchers call training transfer, meaning whether skills practiced in a structured session actually carry over into how a person behaves during a real, unscripted, high pressure moment at work. That gap matters. A short workshop can reliably shift how someone scores on a questionnaire immediately afterward without us knowing whether that shift holds up months later in the actual conditions where compassion is hardest to access, which are usually the conditions of genuine stress, time pressure, and personal depletion. A workshop is a controlled environment. It removes many of the exact triggers, competing demands, exhaustion, someone being difficult toward you at the same moment you are meant to be caring toward them, that make compassion hard to access in the first place. So, a measured improvement inside that controlled environment tells us the underlying skill can shift without necessarily telling us whether it shifts where it is needed most. Broader meta analytic reviews of compassion focused interventions describe the overall pattern as showing moderate improvements in well being, along with some evidence that this kind of training can promote measurable neuroplasticity and support stress resilience over time. But the same reviews are careful to note that much of the underlying evidence remains preliminary, which limits how confidently we can draw firm causal conclusions about exactly which mechanisms are doing the work and in what order. This is worth holding on to, not as a reason to dismiss the findings, but as a reason to stay appropriately modest about how far we can generalize from any single study. A brief pilot study showing a shift in brain activity in people with chronic pain, for instance, is genuinely informative, but it is a pilot study run with a relatively small number of participants, and the field is still in the process of building toward larger, more definitive trials that can tell us how durable these changes actually are and for whom they hold most reliably. So, where does this leave the original puzzle we opened with, the recoil you might feel standing in front of someone else's pain? I think the honest answer is that the recoil is neither a flaw nor something to simply push through by force of will. It appears to be the predictable output of a fast automatic system that evolved in a real sense to protect you first. What separates a moment of instinctive withdrawal from a moment of genuine, effective compassion is not the absence of that first reaction. It is what happens next, whether the automatic alarm gets allowed to resolve into a slower, more deliberate orientation toward the other person's actual experience, supported by mentalizing, by reward related motivation circuitry, and, crucially, by whether your own history and your own threat system make that resolution easy or genuinely difficult to reach. None of this makes compassion less real or less valuable. If anything, understanding the actual mechanism makes it more workable because it tells you where to intervene. If you consistently find yourself stuck in distress rather than moving into care, the research suggests that is not a character defect to be ashamed of. It may point to a genuine, specific target, whether that is building attentional stability first, addressing a threat response to warmth that has real roots in your own history, or seeking out training that specifically and deliberately works with feelings of care rather than assuming that generalized calm alone will get you there. Compassion, in other words, is less like a switch you either have access to or do not, and more like a skill built from several distinct components, each of which can be understood, and, with the right kind of practice, each of which appears capable of being strengthened. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'm Esther Adams, and this has been Strides to Solutions.